Welcome to Starlight Sci-Fi, where stories of the extraordinary become reality. Explore the unknown, challenge the impossible, and witness humanity's strength among the stars. Imagine this: you're an ordinary human, just trying to navigate life in the vast galactic community. Then one day, an alien family tells you they've chosen you for their daughter. There's no saying no, no escape. What would you do? Here's my story, and trust me, it's not what you think. The galaxy had grown vast and interconnected, with hundreds of alien species coexisting in a complex web of diplomacy, trade, and fragile peace. Humans, relatively new to the galactic community, were often treated as anomalies, unpredictable and curious, but too insignificant in numbers to wield much influence. That insignificance, however, came with an odd benefit. Humans rarely found themselves entangled in the politics of other species, or so I thought. I was stationed on Geron, a picturesque but distant world, as part of a collaborative project between humanity and the Zorath, one of the most mysterious and known species in the known galaxy. As a terraforming engineer, my job was straightforward: oversee the construction of a massive atmospheric generator that would enhance Zeron's already lush environment. I didn't interact much with the locals beyond technical briefings. They were polite but aloof, towering figures with gleaming exoskeletons and glowing, insect-like eyes that made it hard to read their expressions. Still, I had no complaints. The work was steady, the view spectacular, and the Zorath left me to my own devices until the day they didn't. It started with an official summons from the Zorath Council. These were the elders, the keepers of their species' laws and traditions, and receiving a message from them was as rare as it was unsettling. The message was brief and formal, instructing me to report to their Grand Hall immediately. I assumed it was about the project, maybe a new timeline or technical adjustment. I couldn't have been more wrong. The council chamber was as imposing as the Zorath themselves. Towering crystalline pillars refracted light into shifting rainbows, and the air hummed with an energy that made my skin crawl. The elders, seated on ornate thrones carved from the planet's glowing minerals, regarded me silently as I approached. Their expressions, if you could call them, that were unreadable. But there was a palpable gravity in the room. One of them finally addressed me through a translator device, their telepathic language too alien for human comprehension. Human, you have been chosen. Chosen? The word hung in the air, heavy and ominous. For what? I wondered, but before I could ask, the elder continued. Your people's bond with the Zorath is sacred. As per the terms of the ancient pact, every 50 revolutions, one human is called to solidify our alliance. You will fulfill this obligation by entering into union with the Zorath of high standing. I blinked, unsure if I'd heard correctly. A union. Was this some mistranslation? But no, the elder's words were precise. They were telling me, calmly and with absolute authority, that I was to marry one of their own. It didn't matter that I had no knowledge of this ancient pact. It didn't matter that I was already overwhelmed with my work and had no interest in alien traditions. The terms were clear. Refusal was not an option. They handed me a crystalline tablet, etched with glowing symbols I couldn't read but instinctively understood. It was a contract binding and unbreakable. By touching the tablet, I would seal the agreement, becoming bound not just to the Zorath woman they had chosen for me, but to their entire species in ways I couldn't yet comprehend. I hesitated, but the weight of their gaze left no room for negotiation. Humans were a small voice in the grand chorus of galactic politics, and this contract, written centuries ago, was a reminder of that. Refusal, they implied, would not only dishonor the Zorath but jeopardize humanity's fragile standing in the Intergalactic Alliance. With trembling fingers, I placed my hand on the tablet. The symbols flared brightly, and for a moment a strange warmth spread through my palm, a sensation that felt more like a binding chain than a ceremonial gesture. The elder spoke again. It is done. The union will proceed immediately. I wanted to ask questions, to argue, to demand some kind of explanation, but the look in their eyes, cold and unyielding, made it clear there was no room for debate. As I was escorted out of the chamber, the realization of what had just happened began to sink in. I wasn't just an engineer on Geron anymore. I was now part of something far larger, something ancient and unrelenting, and I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever I had been bound to was far more dangerous than anyone had let on. The announcement of my union didn't lead to a celebratory gathering or an ornate ceremony, as I might have expected. There were no festivities, no speeches, and no introduction to my so-called bride. Instead, I was escorted in silence to a transport pod, flanked by 2 towering Zorath guards who radiated authority and disinterest. The pod descended deep beneath the surface of Zeron, farther than I had ever imagined there was anything to see. The atmosphere grew heavier as we descended. The walls of the shaft were carved from the same glowing minerals that seemed to power the Zorath's entire civilization, casting eerie, shifting light patterns around the small cabin. The hum of the machinery grew louder, resonating in my chest like a living thing. I wanted to ask where we were going, or what would happen. But the guards didn't seem interested in answering, or maybe they couldn't. When the pod finally stopped, the doors slid open to reveal a massive chamber. It was unlike anything I had ever seen, even in my travels to other alien worlds. The walls pulsed faintly, as if alive, and at the center of the room stood a towering crystalline structure shaped like an enormous, jagged spire. The spire glowed with an internal light, its radiance shifting between soft blues and fiery reds, as though it were breathing. A group of Zorath elders was already waiting for me. They stood in a perfect semicircle around the spire, their translucent exoskeletons shimmering in the chamber's light. One of them gestured for me to step forward, and though my instincts screamed at me to run, I forced myself to obey. "This is the binding chamber," one of the elders announced, their voice amplified by a translator embedded in the walls. "The union is not merely a tradition. It is a sacred ritual, etched into the foundation of our existence." I didn't know what they meant by that, but there was no time to ask. Two of the elders approached me, carrying an object that looked like a floating ring of pure light. It hovered between their hands, its edges shimmering with an energy I couldn't identify. They called it the bonding band, a symbol of the union between me and my chosen bride, but I could sense it was more than symbolic. The moment the band touched my wrist, it tightened like a living thing, wrapping itself snugly around my arm. A jolt of warmth shot through my body, almost electric, and for a brief moment, I felt something or someone reach into my mind. It wasn't invasive, not yet, but it was there, probing lightly at the edges of my thoughts. The elders continued their ritual, chanting in their melodic, telepathic language. I couldn't understand the words, but I felt their weight. The chamber seemed to respond, its light growing brighter with each verse, the spire's glow intensifying until it was nearly blinding. My heart pounded as the band around my wrist pulsed in sync with the spire, connecting me to whatever power was contained within this ancient place. When the ritual ended, the chamber fell silent. The spire dimmed, and the band on my wrist settled into a faint, constant glow. It felt like a mark, a reminder that my life was no longer entirely my own. One of the elders finally spoke. "It is done. The bond is sealed. You are now united with Veyra, heir to the Zorath lineage." The name Veyra rang in my mind, but it meant little to me then. I hadn't even seen her. Was she here, watching from the shadows? Or was this some distant, impersonal connection? I was given no time to dwell on these questions. The guards motioned for me to leave, their silent gestures as commanding as ever. As they escorted me back to the surface, I realized I still had no idea what being united with the Zorath truly meant. All I knew was that the band on my wrist wasn't just a symbol of this union, it was alive, tethering me to something vast and unknowable. And I couldn't help but feel that the ritual had bound me to much more than just a marriage. It had tied me to the heart of the Zorath themselves. My new life as a husband in the Zorath world began with a silent, overwhelming isolation. I had been plucked from my role as a terraforming engineer, a job where I had thrived, and thrust into an existence I barely understood. The transport pod carried me to a sprawling fortress nestled high in Geron's crystalline mountains, a structure that seemed to grow out of the peaks themselves. Its translucent walls shimmered like ice under the twin suns, and its towers pierced the low-hanging clouds, creating an almost ethereal image of grandeur. Inside, the fortress was a maze of vast, open halls filled with refracting light. The Zorath had no need for artificial illumination. The fortress itself glowed faintly, as though powered by some ancient, unseen energy source. Yet, for all its beauty, the place felt cold, unwelcoming. The Zorath who inhabited it moved with eerie grace, their towering figures casting long shadows on the crystal floors. They acknowledged my presence, but only briefly, with what seemed like polite disinterest. The strangest part, however, was my bride, Veyra. I met her for the first time in a grand chamber at the center of the fortress, where she stood surrounded by advisors and attendants. Her presence was commanding, even regal. She was taller than most humans, with the same shimmering exoskeleton as the others of her kind. But there was something different about her, a subtle glow in her eyes, a quiet intensity that set her apart. Veyra didn't speak to me. In fact, she didn't seem particularly interested in my existence at all. She gave me a single, assessing glance before returning her attention to the council gathered around her. They spoke in their telepathic language, their thoughts weaving into patterns I couldn't decipher, and I felt like an intruder in a conversation I was never meant to hear. Days turned into weeks, and I saw little of Veyra beyond these brief glimpses in formal settings. She was deeply involved in the politics of her people, meeting with elders, advisors, and emissaries from other worlds. I learned from whispers of the fortress staff that she was the heir to the Zorath leadership, a position that came with immense responsibility. Our union, it seemed, was less about companionship and more about maintaining the fragile threads of tradition and diplomacy that held her people together. In the meantime, I was left to adjust to life in the fortress, a task that proved nearly impossible. The Zorath didn't eat, drink, or sleep the way humans did. Their sustenance came from the energy-rich crystals that lined their environment, absorbed directly into their bodies. Meals were a solitary, alien affair for me, as the Zorath saw no need for communal dining or conversation. Despite their polite indifference, I could feel the weight of their watchful eyes on me. Every step I took, every action I made, was observed and catalogued. The band on my wrist served as a constant reminder of my bond to their world, glowing faintly whenever I was in Veyra's presence, as though it acknowledged her authority over me. I tried to occupy my time by exploring the fortress, but even that proved difficult. Many areas were restricted, guarded by silent sentinels who offered no explanation but made it clear I wasn't welcome. The places I could access felt vast and empty, filled with relics and artifacts, whose purpose I couldn't begin to understand. Yet, despite the isolation, I began to notice something strange about Veyra. At times, I would catch her alone in the fortress gardens, standing among the glowing flora with a look of quiet contemplation. She seemed distant, even from her own people, as though carrying a weight that no one else could see. I started piecing together the fragments of information I overheard during my time there. The Zorath were a species bound by tradition, their lives dictated by rituals and obligations passed down through countless generations. Veyra, as the heir, bore the brunt of these expectations, and our union was just one of many sacrifices she had to make. But there was more to it than that. There was something deeper, something unspoken, in the way she avoided meeting my gaze or speaking directly to me. Though she was the daughter of a proud and ancient lineage, I couldn't help but sense a quiet rebellion simmering beneath the surface. It was as if she, too, was trapped by the very system that had ensnared me, a system that demanded obedience above all else. The realization left me uneasy. Whatever the Zorath expected from this union, it was clear that both Veyra and I were merely players in a much larger game. And while the band on my wrist served as a constant reminder of my connection to her, it also began to feel like a leash, pulling me toward something I couldn't yet see. Veyra's silence wasn't just avoidance, it was a barrier, one I couldn't yet break through. But beneath the cold, distant exterior, I sensed there was a story she wasn't ready to share. And somehow, I knew that when that story came to light, it would change everything. As the days turned to weeks, my isolation began to wear on me. But it wasn't just the silence, or the alien customs that unnerved me, it was the strange, unshakable sense that I was being watched. Not by the Zorath guards or the ever-vigilant attendants of the fortress, but by something else. At first, I dismissed it as paranoia. After all, the fortress itself seemed alive, its crystalline walls pulsing faintly with energy that hummed in my ears whenever I walked its halls. It was easy to imagine eyes in every shadow, whispers in the faint vibrations of the air. But the feeling persisted, growing stronger each night. I would lie awake in my quarters, staring at the translucent ceiling that glimmered softly with the planet's natural light, and feel the weight of an unseen gaze pressing down on me. The band on my wrist, ever a faint, glowing presence, began to pulse erratically during these moments, as though reacting to some unseen force. One night, I decided I'd had enough. I couldn't sleep, and the thought of staying confined to my room only made the sensation worse. I left my quarters and wandered the empty halls of the fortress, hoping the walk would clear my mind. The Zorath didn't seem to follow a strict sleep cycle, but the corridors were unusually quiet, their usual occupants absent. The silence only heightened my unease. As I walked, the fortress seemed to shift around me, its walls shimmering in ways they hadn't before. The glow of the crystals grew brighter, almost guiding me down unfamiliar passages I didn't recall seeing before. At first, I thought I was lost. but the band on my wrist began to pulse steadily, as though it knew where I was going. Against my better judgment, I followed its rhythm. The path led me to a secluded chamber deep within the fortress. Unlike the other rooms, which were grand and open, this one was small and dimly lit, its walls covered in intricate carvings that seemed to shimmer with an inner light. At the center of the room stood a pedestal, and on it rested a single, jagged shard of crystal. It pulsed faintly, its glow synchronized with the band on my wrist. As I approached the shard, a wave of dizziness washed over me. My vision blurred, and for a moment, I felt as though I were standing in two places at once, here in the chamber and somewhere else entirely. Images flashed before my eyes, towering spires crumbling to ash, shadowy figures moving in the darkness, and a pair of glowing eyes watching me with an intensity that burned into my mind. The sensation passed as quickly as it had come, leaving me breathless and disoriented. I stumbled back from the pedestal, my heart pounding. Whatever I had just seen, it wasn't a dream or a hallucination. It was a warning. Before I could make sense of it, a faint sound reached my ears, a low, resonant hum that seemed to come from the walls themselves. It grew louder, more insistent, until I realized it wasn't just sound. It was a voice, though not one I could understand. The fortress was speaking to me, its words flowing through the band on my wrist like a current of energy. I didn't know what it was trying to tell me, but I knew one thing for certain: I wasn't supposed to be here. The pulsing of the band grew frantic, urging me to leave, and I didn't need to be told twice. I turned and ran, the hum following me like a shadow until I finally stumbled back into the familiar corridors of the fortress. The next day, I tried to act as though nothing had happened. I went about my routine, avoiding the gazes of the Jorath and keeping my thoughts to myself. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I had stumbled onto something I wasn't meant to see, something ancient and dangerous, hidden deep within the heart of the fortress. Later that evening, I saw Veyra for the first time in days. She stood in the fortress gardens, her gaze distant as she watched the twin suns dip below the horizon. For a moment, I considered approaching her, asking her about the shard and the visions I had seen, but the look on her face stopped me. There was a sadness in her expression, a quiet weight that mirrored the unease growing inside me. She glanced in my direction briefly, her eyes locking onto mine for a heartbeat, and I felt the faintest ripple in the band on my wrist, a connection I couldn't understand but couldn't deny. That was when I realized something else. Whatever was happening to me wasn't just about me. Veyra knew more than she let on, and whatever secrets she was keeping, they were tied to the fortress, the shard, and the bond we now shared. The warning I had received wasn't just for me. It was for both of us. And the deeper I delved into the mystery, the more certain I became that our union was part of a larger plan, one that could unravel everything the Jorath had built. The encounter with the shard lingered in my mind like a splinter I couldn't remove. Its presence, the visions it had shown me, and the hum of its alien voice haunted my thoughts, even as I tried to return to my daily routines. But the routines themselves had begun to change. The Jorath around me, who once seemed indifferent to my presence, now felt subtly different. Their movements were more deliberate, their gazes longer, their silences heavier. It wasn't just paranoia. Something had shifted after that night. The band on my wrist, once a faint and passive glow, had become more active. It pulsed at irregular intervals, sometimes growing warm against my skin, other times pulling me in directions I couldn't understand. When I tried to ignore it, it would thrum with an insistent energy, as though it had a will of its own. I avoided the shard's chamber, though I often felt the band urging me toward it, a faint tug that grew stronger whenever I passed certain hallways. The fortress itself seemed complicit, its glowing walls and shifting corridors subtly guiding me toward that forbidden place. But I resisted, telling myself that I needed answers first. My opportunity came unexpectedly. One of the Jorath elders summoned me to their council chamber, a vast, echoing space lined with crystalline pillars that sparkled with shifting colors. The council rarely addressed me directly, and when they did, it was usually to discuss my role in the Union. But this time, the atmosphere was different. The elder who spoke to me seemed more cautious than usual, Their telepathic voice projected through the translator embedded in the chamber walls. "You have felt it, haven't you?" they asked. I hesitated. "Felt what?" The elder's gaze lingered on the band around my wrist, and for the first time, I sensed something akin to unease in their demeanor. The binding band connects you not only to Veyra, but to the very heart of our people. It is a link forged through generations, a bond older than any of us. But there are things within the bond echoes of what came before that even we do not fully understand. Their words stirred something in me, a memory of the visions the shard had shown me. "The shard," I said, my voice trembling slightly. "It showed me something. A vision. Destruction. Shadows. What does it mean?" The elder didn't answer immediately. Instead, they turned to one of the crystalline pillars, placing a hand against its surface. The crystal responded to their touch, its glow intensifying as images began to form within its depths. What I saw made my blood run cold. The images were similar to the ones I had seen in the shard, towering Zoreth spires collapsing in flames, shadowy figures consuming entire cities, and a deep, pulsing darkness that seemed to stretch across the stars. But there was something new, a figure at the center of the chaos, its form obscured by light but unmistakably powerful. "This is the echo," the elder said. "A remnant of an ancient calamity that nearly destroyed our people. The shard you encountered is a fragment of that history, a piece of the echo that we have kept sealed away for generations. It is both a warning and a weapon, one that must never be awakened." I felt a chill run down my spine. Why is it reacting to me? The elder turned to me, their glowing eyes unreadable. "Because you are human. The binding band was designed to unite our people with yours, but humans are unpredictable, their minds untethered from the structures that define our existence. The bond you share with Veyra is unlike any we have ever seen. It is unstable." Their words filled me with a growing sense of dread. The band on my wrist, the shard's visions, the fortress's shifting corridors, it was all connected, part of a web of secrets and traditions that I was now entangled in. And at the center of it all was Veyra. As if summoned by my thoughts, Veyra appeared in the chamber's doorway. Her presence silenced the elder, who stepped back respectfully as she approached. She didn't speak to me, but the band on my wrist pulsed sharply as she drew closer, a jolt of energy that sent a shiver through my body. Without a word, she gestured for me to follow her. I hesitated, glancing at the elder, but they simply nodded, their expression unreadable. Reluctantly, I followed Veyra out of the chamber and into the fortress's winding halls. She led me to a secluded garden, its glowing flora casting soft light against the darkening sky. For a moment, we stood in silence, the weight of unspoken words hanging between us. Then, she turned to me, her eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. The band on my wrist pulsed again, and this time, I felt something deeper, a connection, a thread of emotion that wasn't my own. It was Veyra, her thoughts brushing against mine like a whisper. She wasn't speaking, but I could feel her intent, her urgency. She was trying to show me something she couldn't say aloud. And as her thoughts intertwined with mine, I realized the truth. Whatever the shard had shown me, whatever the echo was, it wasn't just a warning. It was a promise of what was to come. Veyra's unspoken connection left me restless, my thoughts swirling in a chaotic loop. The energy of her emotions still lingered in my mind, a mix of fear, urgency, and something else I couldn't quite define. It wasn't just about the shard or the visions I could feel that much. This was about the echo, the ancient calamity the elder had warned me about. But what was it? Why had I been dragged into this centuries-old web of secrets? The binding band on my wrist pulsed again, this time with a steady rhythm that seemed to pull me toward a new destination. It wasn't subtle anymore. The energy coursing through the band felt insistent, almost commanding, resigned to the strange force guiding me. I followed its lead through the fortress, weaving past glowing halls and crystalline chambers that seemed emptier than usual. The path led me deeper into the fortress, to areas I hadn't yet explored. The air grew colder, the crystalline glow of the walls dimming to a faint shimmer as I descended a spiraling staircase. My pulse quickened. This part of the fortress felt different, older, heavier, as though the weight of the past pressed against every surface. The band's glow intensified, bathing the narrow hall in a soft light that barely cut through the shadows. At the base of the staircase, I found myself in a vast chamber. It was nothing like the polished beauty of the upper levels. The walls were rough, jagged, and lined with markings I didn't recognize. In the center of the room was a large circular platform, etched with intricate patterns that pulsed faintly in sync with the band on my wrist. Suspended above it, seemingly weightless, was another shard. This shard was larger than the first one I had seen, its surface fractured and glowing with a dark, ominous energy. The light it emitted wasn't the vibrant, crystalline glow of the fortress. Instead, it was darker, deeper, almost like shadows trapped within glass. As I stepped closer, I felt the same dizziness as before, the room spinning around me as the shard's energy reached out to me. Images flooded my mind, sharper and more vivid than the ones from the first shard. I saw the Jorath homeworld, once a thriving beacon of life, consumed by an all-encompassing darkness. Cities crumbled, skies burned, and a black void spread like a plague, devouring everything in its path. And then I saw them, the figures from my earlier vision. They weren't just shadows. They were living beings, their forms towering and grotesque, their glowing eyes burning with malice. The vision shifted again, showing me something new, Veyra. She stood in the midst of the destruction, her body glowing with the same energy as the shard. But she wasn't consumed by the darkness. She was fighting it, holding it at bay with sheer force of will. Her form flickered, her strength waning, but she stood defiant against the void. The connection between us flared, and I realized something profound. Veyra wasn't just an heir to the Jorath leadership. She was their shield, their last line of defense against the Echo's return. The shard, the binding band, and even our forced union were all part of a larger plan, a plan to prevent the Echo from consuming their world again. But something had gone wrong. The band's connection to me. The shard's reaction to my presence, it wasn't supposed to happen this way. The shard pulsed violently, and I stumbled back, my heart racing as the visions faded. The energy in the chamber felt suffocating, as though the shard's presence was alive and aware of me. The binding band burned against my skin, and I felt an overwhelming urge to leave, but I couldn't move. The shard's energy gripped me, pulling me deeper into its influence. And then, just as I thought I would collapse under its weight, the connection was severed. The band dimmed, the shard's glow faded, and the chamber grew eerily silent. I collapsed to my knees, gasping for air, my mind reeling from what I had seen. When I looked up, Veyra was standing at the edge of the chamber. Her gaze was steady, her expression unreadable, but the glow in her eyes betrayed a mix of emotions: relief, fear, and something akin to guilt. She stepped forward, the binding band flaring briefly as she approached, and I felt her presence in my mind again. This time, there were no words, no emotions. Just a single image burned into my thoughts, the Echo, looming over the Jorath homeworld, and Veyra standing in its path. And then, a question silent but deafening. Would I stand with her, or would I let the darkness consume us all? The silence that followed Veyra's unspoken question was as heavy as the vision still swirling in my mind. The image of her standing against the Echo burned brightly in my thoughts, refusing to fade. The binding band on my wrist pulsed faintly, as if awaiting my answer. But how could I respond to something I barely understood? I wasn't a soldier, a hero, or even a willing participant in this strange union. I was just a human, dragged into an ancient conflict that had nothing to do with me, or so I thought. Veyra's gaze never wavered. She stood tall, her form illuminated by the faint glow of the shard behind me. It was then that I realized she wasn't just asking for my help. She was depending on me, and the weight of that realization hit me like a blow. Somehow I was connected to this, tied to the Jorath's fate in ways I couldn't yet grasp. The binding band wasn't just a ceremonial tether, it was a bridge between our worlds, and the Echo was something we had to face together, or not at all. The air in the chamber seemed to thicken, the shard's energy thrumming faintly in the background, as if responding to my turmoil. My thoughts raced, each possibility more terrifying than the last. If the visions were true, the Echo wasn't just a threat to the Jorath. It was a force of annihilation, capable of consuming entire worlds. If it wasn't stopped, it would come for Earth eventually. The Jorath's fight wasn't just their own, it was humanity's as well. But how could I possibly make a difference? I was no match for the ancient power contained in the shard, or the darkness it represented. And yet, the binding band continued to pulse, filling me with a strange, unfamiliar energy. It wasn't just a link to Veyra, it was something more. Something alive. I could feel it now, coursing through my veins, connecting me to the shard, the fortress, and Veyra herself. It was a power neither human nor Zorath, but something in between. The realization struck me with a clarity I couldn't ignore. The binding band wasn't just a bond of unity. It was a key. A key to unlocking the strength needed to confront the echo. That was why the shard reacted to me, why the fortress seemed to guide me. The Zorath elders had designed the union not as a symbolic gesture, but as a final line of defense, a blending of two species. Their strengths combined to create something capable of standing against the darkness. Veyra stepped closer, and for the first time I truly understood the weight she carried. She wasn't just a warrior or a leader, she was a beacon of hope for her people. But she couldn't carry this burden alone. The binding band flared brightly as her thoughts brushed against mine, and in that moment, I made my decision. The shard's energy surged as I stepped onto the platform, its fractured surface glowing more intensely with each passing second. I reached out, my hand trembling as it hovered above the shard. The binding band burned against my skin, and for a moment I thought the energy would overwhelm me. But then, Veyra placed her hand on my shoulder, and the band's energy stabilized, merging with hers. The shard's power flooded through me, overwhelming and alien, yet strangely familiar. It was like touching the heartbeat of the universe, a force both destructive and beautiful. The visions returned, sharper than ever. The echo, its towering form of shadows and void, looming over the Zorath and Earth alike. But this time I wasn't just a spectator. I felt the power of the shard coursing through me, its light pushing back against the darkness. The binding band connected me to Veyra, and through her, to the Zorath. Their memories, their pain, their hopes, all of it became a part of me. I saw their history, their resilience, their desperate fight to survive. And in return, I offered them something they didn't have: humanity's stubborn defiance, our unyielding will to fight even in the face of impossible odds. Together, Veyra and I channeled the shard's energy, its light blazing brighter, until it consumed the entire chamber. The darkness of the echo, though distant, seemed to recoil, as if sensing the strength we now held. For the first time, I felt something I hadn't since arriving on this alien world: hope. When the light faded, the shard's glow had dimmed, its energy spent for now. The binding band on my wrist pulsed faintly, a steady rhythm that echoed Veyra's heartbeat. We stood together in silence, the weight of what we had just done sinking in. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot, but for the first time, I felt like we had a chance. The fortress seemed to hum softly, its walls vibrating with a quiet sense of approval. Veyra turned to me, her eyes filled with gratitude and determination. The binding band flared one final time, and I understood the truth. This wasn't just her fight or mine. It was ours, a battle that would define the future of both our species. And as I looked into the depths of her glowing eyes, I knew one thing for certain: whatever came next, we would face it together. Thank you for watching Starlight Sci-Fi. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like, subscribe, and share. Leave a comment below with your favorite twist, and let us know what kind of sci-fi stories you'd like to see next. Until next time, keep looking to the stars.